Let's
talk with Erin in New York first. Erin, welcome to the show. How can we help you tonight?
So I had, which kind of stinks because actually, as you were describing past relations with me, I've been there, so I'm going to have to call in another time for that. However, I have and this is going to sound totally stupid, but it's actually true. It's not me. It's actually a friend who's going through this situation. And whenever they talk to me, they're gender fluid. And a lot of the times when we talk deeply, it's more they had a lot of trauma when they were a kid. So they kind of, I feel, saw themselves, they pretty much created this part of themselves that was more outgoing and competitive and protective, like traditional masculine roles. And, but they were biologically female. So I guess now in the future, when they talk about their feminine side, they always refer to the stereotypical traditional stuff. Like, that's when I'm more submissive and meek, and I take those abuses from people because I'm more cooperative and healing. And then they also make a lot of references to, like, if they're trying to compare their independence, I guess, or their ability to, like, fight for themselves or provide for themselves. They're always like, yeah, and those guys, they even have dicks, and, like, they make gestures to their between their legs. So it's hard to hear to like know that I'm not with those traditional roles, but, like, they're still subscribing to them, even though they're fully aware that we're not about stereotypes anymore. Like, gender is pretty much out the window because anybody can do anything they want. So I'm just really confused at, like, and I know if I say something to them, they're going to get on me because we've had some discussions in the past about gender and sex and yada yada yada. So I guess I'm just looking for a sounding board if I'm thinking properly, or not properly, but, like, if I'm not alone in how I'm seeing this negatively affect their life.
Sure.
Yeah.
I think if it helps you empathize rather than, I guess, necessarily wanting to, like, maybe correct the ways that this could be negative, I think it's also important to remember that while a large part of gender is, like, this intrinsic part that is within you, another big part of gender is interpersonal. It's how you interact with the world and the people around you. So while it definitely could have, like, a sort of negative connotation to hear something like, oh, when I feel like more on the feminine side of the spectrum, that's when I start behaving submissively or something like that. There is a portion of that can be true. Because, I mean, in our society, that is a value that at least a large portion of society does ascribe to femininity. So I can see where they're coming from. I think maybe what might be helpful is, like, one thing, I had some of these same notions early into my transition, and one thing that really helped me was reading a lot of books and memoirs written by women to really expand my concept of femininity and what it means to be a woman, you know, to go beyond just this notion that submissive behavior is what, you know, would indicate that. So sorry if that's maybe not a resolution or something to this issue, but I think maybe that can help you kind of connect and empathize a little bit more with your friend from where they're coming from.
Yeah, it's kind of like, I mean, I do get that fully. It's more to the fact of we're in this time period now where we're trying not to, like, because it's gender is the behavioral representation or social representation of sex. Like, we know that females aren't just submissive, and they can be outgoing, competitive, and forceful. And same with guys, they can be nurturing and healing and cooperative. So I almost feel like gender doesn't make sense anymore. And to me, that's a good thing because there's so much pressure put on people because of those roles that we've had in the past since the 40s, like when it first came into psychology stuff. So it just seems, it's weird to see them, like, fight against it so often, but then they still have that ingrained into their head, and they've come a long way on their journey. They used to be they used to not be gender fluid, so they've come out, and that's really awesome, and we've been completely supportive of that.
Yeah, I think another thing to keep in mind here too is that there are two different categories here that I feel are kind of being bled together, as they often are. One side of that is gender identity, and the other side is gender presentation. And a lot of the time, those can kind of get like confused. But I am non-binary. I am not a man or a woman, but there are days where I will act like one or the other. I will dress as a particular gender, or I will embody a particular gender in social situations. And that doesn't necessarily have anything to say about who I am, but rather how I am presenting in the moment. And for me, that's one of the benefits of being NB. I like it because I get to explore and expand and play in all of these different areas. But what it sounds like to me is that your friend may have a very good idea of their gender identity, but might still be struggling a little bit with the presentation element, not just for themselves, but how other people have presented to them in the past. So if they've only seen gender presentation modeled by submissive women and dominant men, then of course that's going to be how they try to express that non-binary or gender fluid identity. And it might be causing them a lot of, cognitive dissonance as well, because I'm sure that they understand logically, right, that there are more ways to be. But if that's what they've grown up with, if that's what they've been ingrained with, it's going to take a lot of very intentional thought and intentional time to pick through that and actually find what works for them. And the best thing that you can do as a friend is be there as a sounding board, be there to listen, be there to support without judgment, so that they can come to you and be like, hey, I was thinking about this thing. What are your thoughts? Because it sounds like you guys have a really good bond and that this person values your outlook and your opinions. I'd say just make sure you maintain that. And that's as much as anybody can ask of you as a friend.
Well, I mean, is true. To some extent, they do value my opinion. We've also had a couple of head-to-head discussions about I'm a skeptic and they are not, and they subscribe to a bunch of different stuff. So I feel they let that conflict bleed over into other things like this. But obviously, it's definitely something we're trying to work on.
Yeah, and it's going to be a work in progress.
Yeah, I'd like to just perhaps offer a slightly different angle to this, and you can let me know whether this lines up or resonates it or not. But I guess the sense that I'm getting from you is that your friend has expressed to you that they kind of conceptualize within their own mind themselves in these like different categories, and they sort of have labeled what we might otherwise call like the shadow self versus the idealized self, or however whatever model we want to use. It seems like they are sort of describing, this is my masculine side and they're wonderful and strong and everything else, and then my feminine side is kind of a dumb little girl, and using some negative language around that. And if I have it right at all, and if I understand where you're coming from, I could definitely see why that would be frustrating, because don't describe girls that way. Don't describe women that way. That's not necessarily an accurate depiction of what, a feminist idea of what a woman or what a human really is. And if that is the case, I might say that, what goes on within somebody's mind is sort of their business. And if that model helps them to conceptualize themselves, then there's some value there. But it does sound like they're using some pretty toxic language to describe femininity, and that's maybe not sitting right. Is that at all in line with what you're experiencing?
Very much so, yeah. When they talk about, they're in their raw moments and they're talking about some of the trauma in the past, they often bring up the fact that they saw themselves as female / a woman, and or at least that's all they've been taught and raised to believe. And then, so when they get targeted by their family members, they kind of resort back to that mentality of like, I'm only a woman. Unfortunately, they also come from like a really reclusive sect of, I think it might be evangelical. I'm not sure.
Sounds about right.
It exists. Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there.
Sure.
But I feel like you're hitting the nail on the head. That's the main part of it. And I just don't, if they're trying to be so forward with like being supportive of the GRSN community, and they don't want to see those roles imposed on other women, like it doesn't make sense they still adopt these things to me.
Yeah, well, they certainly wouldn't be the first person to internalize some heteronormativity and some toxicity. It's certainly I don't want to speak for anybody, but I think that every gay or queer or trans person to some extent is going to have to learn how to cope with some of those beliefs and some of those ideas, and this just seems to be where they're at on their journey. That doesn't excuse shitty behavior. That doesn't give them license to be critical and crude about women or anybody else for that matter. And you do have something of a responsibility here to push back and to decide whether or not this relationship is for you. But I also want to just really preach compassion for the experiences that led them here. I mean, their thoughts and their emotions are valid, even if they aren't based on reality or grounded in a kind and educated and compassionate understanding of what femininity actually means. So I hope that gives you something to work with here.
Yeah, thank you so much for calling in,
Yeah.
Erin. This was a really good conversation.
Thank you very much. I do appreciate the feedback and getting a sounding board. There's a bunch of people who they're much closer to me, so if I talk to them about this, they don't necessarily see the impartiality of the discussion. So this was good to get like a third-party observer, kind of.
Awesome. Well, that's what we're here for. Thank you so much for calling in, and you have a lovely rest of your day, okay?